All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today we are diving into the life and career of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, so stick around. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how excited I am for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, which is coming up August 22nd to 24th. So I'll be the MC this year, so I'll be there all weekend long, and I'm playing, it sounds like on Saturday. And last year was the first Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, and it was an absolute blast. We had Dave Stamey is going to be there again this year. We had Dallas Burrows last year. Dallas Burrows, that show was amazing last year, and he's coming again this year. Ben Haggard is headlining. Chad Bushnell is going to be there. It's going to be an absolute party, and I can't tell you how stoked I am. And now is the time to get your tickets. So if you've been thinking about doing it, now is the time. And I've got a promo code for you guys. The promo code is GeorgeCroftKM. At checkout here to get your tickets for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival. So come on out. They've got there's campsites available. There's RV campsites. There's tent campsites. I think the cabins are sold out right this second, but there's first come first serve camping in the campgrounds below in the Forest Service campgrounds. It's going to be an awesome weekend full of fun and just fantastic performances. So come on out, get your tickets while you can. I've also got some dates coming up, so come out and see me. I'll be June 19th. I'll be at Tano's in Orangevale. And the next day, June 20th, I'll be at Red Bus Brewing in Folsom. And then, obviously, the big news is the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, August 22nd to 24th. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support, and that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my link tree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one. And I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving. And we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out. And hopefully I'll see you soon. So Brian Wilson just died a couple of weeks ago here, as of the recording of this show. So I figured we'd dive in here because he's got some tie-ins with a previous episode that we did. So he's born in 1942 in Inglewood, and the more I dove into this story, the more it's like you see sort of the tragic struggle of a kid sort of trying to get past his, abusive childhood, marked by severe mental illness and substance abuse problems, while simultaneously being wildly talented. And that's sort of that seems to be a trend in our episodes, guys that are just simultaneously wildly talented and tortured. But Brian Wilson is probably one of the more severe cases. So he's born in 1942 in Inglewood. And the first thing to know is the story really starts with his dad, a guy named Murray Wilson. And there's been lots of, books written about this. And, I'm not the first, person to go to for this part of the story. But Murray Wilson had kind of his own musical ambitions initially, but it didn't work. He gave it enough of a run that he had some contacts in the music industry, but at the time when he's having kids and raising a family, he owns, I think it was a construction company or some he's in the trades, and but he still had this musical dream, and he also seems to have been a pretty nasty narcissist at the same time here. So all the boys, so there's the three brothers that start the Beach Boys eventually. It's Dennis, Carl, and Brian. And then their cousin is also in there. But their early childhood is marked by, pretty serious physical and mental abuse at the hands of their dad. And it doesn't seem like, it's not like substance abuse driven. It's not like he's just a mean drunk or something. He's just a mean dude, it seems like. And they have that, as usually happens, they have this conflicting relationship with him where they simultaneously love their dad, but he's also just a hellion to live with. And to the point where so Brian Wilson is actually almost deaf, I think, in his right ear. And depending on what you read and where you find it, some people attribute that to Murray Wilson whacking Brian in the head with a 2x4 at one point. And Brian Wilson has himself kind of given contradictory versions of that story, where he'll say, and he says in his book that it's congenital. Like in his book, he talks about it without even mentioning his dad. He's like, oh yeah, my deafness in my ear, from childhood. I think he might even say it's congenital in the book. But there are other people that seem to believe that was because Murray whacked him with something. And anyway, and so there's recordings of the Beach Boys, kind of initially sort of joking around about it. So basically, Brian Wilson very early on is recognized to be this kind of musical savant kid, where he's harmonizing at a young age. He's picking up instruments like crazy. And, when he starts this band with his brothers and his cousin, they're good right off the bat. And Murray dives right in as their manager. And then he, straight out of a textbook, starts exerting his, failed aspirations. He's going to live that life vicariously through his kids. And he does it pretty forcefully. And which initially, it's weird because initially that works. And if it wasn't for that dynamic, I don't know if the Beach Boys would have initially survived, because Murray is the one that gets them the deal at Capitol Records. He's the one, he had enough, lingering contacts in the music business that he's able to coordinate that and kind of get them in the room with the right people. And they, when they get signed to Capitol. But so it's great that his influence was there for that part, but then the more time goes on, the more his relationship with, especially with Brian. Carl seems to be the sort of the golden child favorite, and that obviously, has its effect on everybody's relationship. Dennis is kind of in the middle ground, and Brian is the object of Murray's frustration and, effort. And just it appears to, have been on the receiving end of that abuse way worse than his other two brothers. But so initially, like I said, that dynamic seems to kind of work, where they're recording and they're, and Murray is just really hands-on, almost like he's as a producer. So he's their manager and he's helping produce music. And as time goes on here, it becomes a real problem, especially after they develop some successes. So they, they get, early hits here in 1962. So they've got Surfin' Safari, Surfing in the USA, I Get Around. This I mean, songs that everybody knows, you know, to this day, like Beach Boy classics. Those are this first wave of hits that they get. And Murray is fully exerting himself on the production end. Now, at the same time, obviously, like, as this is going on, Brian's musical prowess is doing its own blossoming, and he's kind of coming into his own as having his musical vision and kind of what he hears in his head and how he wants it to come out in the studio. And Brian really starts to lean into his, like, artsy side. Like, when you hear him talk in his book, the way he describes it, he sees himself as an artist dedicated to a craft. Where Murray and Capitol Records, like Capitol Records in general, was not great for the creative, you know, spirit, because they wanted hits, and once they found something that worked, they wanted, you know, more cowbell. That's what they wanted, and Murray was happy to shoehorn the boys into doing that, but it starts to cause a split pretty early on, and one of the more like, and also. This whole time, Brian is an anxiety-stricken person developing some other mental health issues that would get way worse later. But he's already known as like the sensitive, kind of artistic-y anxiety guy. And which, I mean, fair enough. This dude is in the blender of like success and achievement from like his creative instincts. But the credit for that is being taken by his abusive dad that's like looking over his shoulder the whole time and just squeezing him. And so that sort of comes to a head, I think, in 1966. So, which you can find this on YouTube. Just look up, it's Brian Wilson versus Murray Wilson. And because they're in the studio, and I think it's during the session that they're recording Help Me Rhonda, I think. I could be wrong about that. But so the mics are rolling, so there's really good quality audio of Murray doing it's a perfect snapshot of their relationship and how that all falls apart, because it starts off with Murray getting into the mic being like, all right, boys, quit screwing around, you know, like you know, let's try it again. You gotta, if you want to be great, you gotta do X, Y, and just really just talking the boys down to the point where at one point he says something like, you guys think because you got some hits now, you don't have to try hard and you don't have to put your, you know, your heart into your songs. And he kept saying we. He said, we really got to keep the spirit in the song and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, he's not singing in there, but the way he talked about it was like we. So he's very clearly this narcissistic dude exerting as much control as he can over the room and over the project. And Brian snaps in that audio and is like, hey, I'm running this session, and like it's this really heartbreaking back and forth between a son and his dad, and it falls apart to the point where like they fire Murray as their manager and they kick him out of the goings on with the Beach Boys, and which was, I'm sure, you know, that's traumatic all on its own, and Murray does not take that well. Murray's not like, you know, I mean, obviously he's a narcissist that has just been like wrenched from the thing that he was controlling. And he proceeds to spend time kind of working against the Beach Boys. Like he actually he goes and produces for another band at one point, specifically competing with the Beach Boys, that he's trying to show Brian that their success was because of him. And that fails. And then Brian's kind of making the point that their success is because of him, and they're kind of doing better. So it's this real blow to Murray's ego. And he does not take that sitting down. I mean, he's, you know, Brian still let him be around sometimes, and he was kind of in orbit of certain recording sessions and stuff. But as far as like professional involvement, he's booted from the program here. And so now, here's this moment in 1960. What do we say? No, that was 1964 that happened. That they fire Murray. So here's this moment where this kid who has spent his entire life up to that point trying to be himself despite all this top-down pressure from other people described Murray as a tyrant. Like that was like Dennis and Carl and their cut, like everybody that talks about him says, oh yeah, that dude was a tyrannical pressure on Brian. So now that that pressure's gone, Brian sort of has this moment of standing up and kind of having to get his bearings again. Now he has to go be him without that overbearing but guiding pressure that had been there the whole time. And that doesn't go very well initially. So, basically, okay, so Pet Sounds is coming up here, but basically what happens is, in the touring that followed, Murray getting axed from the group here, Brian's mental health spirals. And one thing that Murray had done is he had kind of really, like I said, he controlled everybody, which had a positive and a negative. On the positive end was he kept the boys out of trouble. Like, he was really like just dad there all the time, keeping them out of the, girls and drugs and, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. With dad looking over your shoulder, it stays pretty contained. When dad is not there, it's not contained anymore. And the boys proceed to start dabbling and all that stuff, which has an exacerbating effect on Brian's mental health that is on shaky legs as it is. And then add on top of that, they're at the height of their success here. So Capitol Records is just pedal to the metal, making these guys tour and pushing them on planes and place to place to place to place. And in 1964, soon after Murray is fired from, managing, they're on a plane going to Texas, I think. And Brian Wilson has a complete mental breakdown. Like, he's screaming on the plane, like, I got to get off this plane, like, get me out of here. He's, hyperventilating. And it sounds like I'm not 100% sure about this because I've seen two conflicting things, but one version of the story is that he does perform the show they were headed to that night. I think he does, because it sounds like he performs, but he's like clearly upset and he's got a problem. His mom drives to Texas, picks Brian up and takes him home. And he says, I'm done touring. So, which he never said I'm done with music. He said I'm done touring, and he intended to lean into his writing and his production stuff. This is where we bump into our other story, because it's after that mental breakdown that the Beach Boys replace him with Glenn Campbell briefly, because, at Capitol Records in Los Angeles, when, all their successes and all the stuff that they're recording, they're using the Wrecking Crew for their music. Like that, this is Golden Age Wrecking Crew, where they weren't even known as the Wrecking Crew yet. The Beach Boys would sort of help them attain that sort of title. It's not an official title or group. It's just sort of a gaggle of people that are really talented and end up on these hundreds of records, and they're, just top-notch musicians. While the Beach Boys are knee-deep in helping them establish that reputation. They had met Glenn Campbell through their work with the Wrecking Crew. So when Brian has this mental breakdown, Glenn Campbell briefly replaces him, singing his parts in harmony and playing bass. He doesn't do that for very long, because like we talked about in the Glenn Campbell episode, he goes on to pursue his own solo career relatively quick. I think it was just a couple of months he was with the Beach Boys. But anyway, so Brian goes home, and that's when, so you've got this, imagine like all these outside forces, like you've got this crazy creative dude, and the pressures on him are like the record label, his dad, like drugs and stuff starting to come in. Like it's all just crushing down the positive thing, which is his creative force that's trying to blossom out. Well, when he quits touring, he still has, he's still signed to Capitol Records, and he's still around Los Angeles with the Wrecking Crew and stuff. He just leans into writing and music production. And in the time, and the Beach Boys goes on, they're out there touring and doing stuff with Glenn Campbell and whoever else. But Brian goes home and really just kind of gets in his laboratory and is unfettered to be as creative as he wants. That is the Pet Sounds album. So which is at the time not a crazy success apparently. It was, people that knew loved that album. Like the Beatles said that album had a huge influence on them even, which is ironic because at the time, part of what drove Brian's mental breakdown was the competition from the Beatles. So the Beach Boys got big, and then the Brits came across the pond, and they were kind of outshining the Beach Boys. And so they had this real, a relationship of mutual respect, but very competitive. And they were kind of eating each other's lunch because they had the same target audience. So But the Beach Boy or the Beatles would say that the Pet Sounds album was, a masterpiece. And so while it's not like a crazy success in sales, it's widely regarded as, even, throughout the rest of his career, Pet Sounds is sort of Brian Wilson's, what are the words like magnum opus, which I didn't know that word until this week, but, learning things. So, but it's like his life's achievement, sort of. And that sort of really sticks it, and that kind of puts a pin in the idea that his success was only because of Murray. So, like, now that he's pulled off the Pet Sounds album, he's on his own legs, and that, he's sort of escaped that initial wave. The problem that follows is, this is where, after that mental breakdown and everything else, Brian starts using marijuana and LSD and some other psychedelics and stuff, which is like par for the course at the time. But as we know now, if you are already prone to, schizophrenia or any of that stuff, and you pour marijuana on the fire, it's not great for everybody. And this is where he starts to have full on hearing voices. Like he's diagnosed soon after with schizoaffective disorder. And because he's manic all the time. He's hearing voices. He's distracted. So his drug use and kind of extracurriculars suddenly start to, do some damage that had not been there previously. So this is where we start. In 1966, they start another album called Smile. And this is where we run into more issues, because songwriting wise, Brian is at full throttle when he, like, all of his stuff is very complicated. He's got really complicated harmony parts. He's messing with different musical compositions. Like, he's like this Mozart character, just making all this stuff come together exactly the way that he wants it. But Capitol Records is still not, despite, well, like I said, not despite Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds is now regarded as a masterpiece, but at the time, Capitol Records was not super happy with it. And so when he goes to make this Smile record, which is more of the same, they're not fully on board here. And so it's, it is having a worse and worse and worse effect on Brian's mental health. So he starts Smile in 1967, but he doesn't finish it. So his spiral is so hard that he actually just abandons that project. And I think he'd written like half the songs on it at that point, but just at the time, the dynamic was so screwed up that he gives up on that, that record. This is where we have a little side quest here that was just an interesting piece of history. So this is 1968, 69, somewhere in here. I think it's 1969. Dennis Wilson, Brian's brother, in a strange turn of events, is driving around in Los Angeles at one point and picks up a hitchhiker. That hitchhiker was Charles Manson. And he proceeds to they become buddies. And he's got him around the music studio. And Brian is immediately sort of put off by Charles Manson. I mean, your radar's pretty good, I guess. If, you get bad vibes from Charles Manson, you are correct. And that's the way it is. But Dennis is just fully sort of, wooed by Charles Manson, brings him into the Manson and his followers are living in Dennis's house at one point, just costing him like thousands of dollars in just cost of having people around, but he's just all right with it. And Dennis starts introducing Charles Manson to all their contacts in the music industry. And the one most notably, it was Terry Melcher, who was a producer at Capitol Records, who was involved with the Beach Boys. The connection between Charles Manson and Terry Melcher is Dennis Wilson. And this is where you get a bizarre recording, so Manson records an EP. I don't know if it's a full album, but and it was it was called something. It's had a crazy title to it. Dang, where did it go? I'll find it here in a second. Let's see here. Oh, there it is. It's Lie, the Love and Terror Cult is Manson's EP. which checks out. That sounds about right. And Brian Wilson is in the room when that's being recorded. So like Brian is around, but he's kind of keeping Manson at an arm's distance. And he just says that he didn't like his vibe, and he was, and Manson kind of knew that, so him and Brian never really gel. He never seems to pursue Brian either. Like Manson seems to kind of focus all of his effort on keeping Dennis around. And so so Dennis gets him in the studio. They record this bizarre EP, which is, if you go back and listen to it, it's everything you think it's going to be from Charles Manson. And but there's a song on there that is like, it's Charles Manson. He wrote the song and he performs it on this, Love and Terror Cult. Oh, it's Never Learn to Love. And Dennis Wilson, now this is where you kind of made a mistake. Dennis Wilson steals that song and puts it on a Beach Boys album and does not credit Charles Manson, which, if you're thinking about slighting a psychotic serial killer, this is why you don't do that. Because Manson feeling slighted by Dennis and Terry Melcher, like, as this has all gone on, and they have like a falling out over the fact that Manson is not credited on this song, like that blows the friendship up. And before this, Manson had been to a party at Terry Melcher's house, so he knew where he lived. And when this all blows up, and everybody's kind of aware that Manson's kind of bad news and to not have this guy around, Manson goes home to his followers. And he knew Terry Melcher's address that he had been to, at this party. And he tells his followers, go into that house and kill everyone inside. And it was because it was Terry Melcher's house. Well, he didn't know that in the months after he had been there, Terry Melcher had moved and Sharon Tate had moved in. So when they go in there and kill, Sharon Tate and her boyfriend and do the whole, what the Manson family is famous for now, they were after the Beach Boys producer that they just didn't know had moved. And so now, put a pin in that idea. That's the Charles Manson story off at a run. If you are already paranoid and anxious and have schizoaffective disorder like Brian Wilson does, and then you realize that the guy you thought was after you may very well be after you and is killing people, like, the worst thing you could do to a paranoid person is prove that they're right. Like, whatever they were panicking about, when it becomes real, that does not help Brian Wilson's mental health spiral. That, like, this guy that he had been kind of nervous about turns out to not just be weird, but dangerous and a murderer. So, because Manson had threatened Dennis and Brian, like, that they were on the list. And, but like, before that had happened, like, he was making threats towards Dennis and Brian, and then he goes to kill the producer and they kill Sharon Tate instead. But, so that obviously just deepens Brian's paranoia for very good reasons. But anyway, so after that, there's kind of a quiet period here where Brian's mental health is, kind of holding at this not great place. So we're into the 1970s now. So in 1973, Murray dies of a heart attack, and he's only 55 at the time. And that, despite having gotten a little bit of space from Murray creatively, that obviously has a giant, impact into Brian's life. And his mental health proceeds to, and this is where the voices really pick up, actually, because later he would describe the voices he's hearing in his head having the same tone that his dad did. So he's hearing Murray's, or similar to Murray's voice in his head, telling him he's not good enough, telling him to try harder. Like, it's his voices in his head. That's the conversation they're having. It's not just wild, unrelated stuff. It's that spirit of you're not good enough in his ear all the time. And his mental health continues down this spiral. So Brian Wilson had gotten married, and he's full on, like, using cocaine and, alcohol and marijuana. We're in full sex, drugs, and rock and roll mode for Brian Wilson, but he is married, and his wife gets him hooked up with this psychologist, a guy named Eugene Landy. And initially, and in Brian's book, he initially kind of talks about that dude, like, positively. Like, he did help him. But he just walks right out of his dad and into this other super controlling, very smart, but very, like, this psychologist basically adopted Brian as his project and wanted everyone to know that whatever came out of Brian was because I fixed him. And that proceeds to just make everything worse. Because so all of a sudden, like, there's like legal battles later to get a restraining order against this doctor. But initially here in the 70s, he finds himself stuck in another controlling and somewhat psychologically abusive relationship with this doctor guy. And that doesn't end. And so somewhere in there, his marriage fails. He gets married again. And then his wife, I think, let's see here. Where is his first wife was Marilyn Rovell, who hired Eugene Landy. But let's see here. So this is 1983 here. So after kind of the psychologist has had his effect, things start to kind of go okay. But then in 1983, Dennis dies. Now, Dennis, who had been Brian's rock up to this point, he was the only one of the Beach Boys that actually knew how to surf. Like, everybody else had tried and they were just terrible at it. And a lot of their early work, like the beach culture thing, most of that, they were writing sort of vicariously through Dennis's experience. And they weren't really trying to like Brian later expressed frustration that the beach was their thing because he thought he was just writing songs for teenagers at the time, like popular culture at the time, and beach culture was they didn't cause that. They were a result of that. And he wanted to get away from the beachy songs anyway. But anyway, so Brian was the only surfer in the bunch. Well, he ends up drowning because he was driving it sounds like his car might have ended up in the ocean. But anyway, somehow he's drunk driving and ends up drowning to death. And that obviously is another just meteoric impact into the life of Brian Wilson. And the songs start to really kind of reflect that. But yeah, so his life sort of limps along here. We're into 1971. He does Sunflower and Surf's Up in 71. And then he writes Till I Die, which is like, if you go back and listen and watch the lyrics of these songs, it's very clearly Brian is trying to heal through his songwriting. Like, they're all tied to all this stuff that he's going through. So then, so this is where the psychologist was still kind of around when that happened. But so his brother Carl and his new wife Melinda, this is, I think, in 1992. So this has been a while that he's been stuck with this psychologist dude. Carl and Melinda put the kibosh on this Dr. Landy character. And this is where these lawsuits come out. And this is where, he gets a restraining order and the whole shebang. And then he starts working on his solo career. And this is where you get a weird sort of bounce back where he starts to kind of perform more and write, sort of as a tribute to his brother. But it's off to a relatively rocky start here. Then in 1998, Carl dies. And he died of lung cancer when he was 51. And that is pretty insurmountable. It's just blow after blow after blow to port. If you look at the story from 30,000 feet, it's this tortured dude who's super creative trying to dig himself out and just hitting speed bump after speed bump after speed bump. The last of which is 1998 when his last and closest brother dies. And because Carl's voice, if you listen to God Only Knows, Carl's singing lead on that. that's the voice of the guy that we're talking about. Just a real linchpin of a dude in the Beach Boys. And now he's gone. So, but like I said, but this is where Brian's reaction to this, he does kind of rally around and start performing, Beach Boys songs as tributes to his brothers. And, this is where you get kind of like the final bounce back, because remember the Smile album that he had abandoned back earlier in the story because of all this stuff that was going on all these years later. So now we're into, let's see here, 2004. So what year was that Smile happened? What did I gotta go back here. 1966, 67. So this is, 35 or 39 years later. And he gets back in the studio and he finishes the Smile album, which is sort of, as far as like song output goes, that's a good crescendo to the story, because he goes back and fixes this thing that he had kind of left undone. And Smile is, successful. It doesn't blow the doors off anything, but it's enough of a success to make the point that he succeeded in his attempt to go back and finish that unfinished business. Let's see here. He won a Grammy for that, which I guess. And so this is Van Dyke Parks was the other co-writer on that, and I think they both they won a Grammy, and that's sort of like that Grammy is sort of symbolizing Brian's ability to overcome all this stuff, and kind of everybody knew it at the time too. So, but anyway, just this crazy up, down, speed bump after speed bump, and the dude just kept on keeping on. And then later, in the 2000s here, he seems to kind of do well. Like he's collaborating with all kinds of people. He's working for, TV shows. He's, this is where he writes his book, and he's sort of reflecting on the whole thing. But anyway, so, and then he, survived to 2025 here. And it sounds like he adopted a couple of kids with Melinda, and like they kind of lived out happily ever after the 2000s hit. So, but up until the early 2000s, they're just a story of getting knocked down and getting back up again, which was, worth remembering. So that's our Brian Wilson episode. Thank y'all for listening, and we'll see you next week.